Father, we thank you as we go through the text tonight. May your Spirit guide us into understanding. Allow us to understand the text, not as we want to understand it, but as you would have us understand it. And let us not leave this Bible study unchanged. As we talked about earlier, allow this to help us align with your will better. Let us not focus on, specifically how we're going to do that, but through your word and through the guidance of your Spirit, allow us to align with your will more and more, day by day. Let us learn to love you better. Do not let us be unchanged by your word. And it's with great gratitude that we pray this in your name. Amen.
God, we are here for you tonight. That's why we're here. That's why we want to be here every week. Help us focus on you. It's in your name we pray. Amen. All right. Today we are in 1 Kings chapter 15, verses 33 through chapter 16, verse 34. And I was talking to some of y'all about this ahead of time. But tonight might very well be the most difficult Bible study I ever have to lead. And the reason why is not because we are talking about really dark material or anything like that. And it's not because we're breaking down some super dense theology. It is simply because this is probably one of the most redundant chapters in the entire Bible. And I don't mean that in a negative way, because as we go through this chapter, we're going to see that I think that is part of the author's intention. Right? I think that whenever you read through this, the author is intentionally throwing so much information at you that it's supposed to leave you frustrated and jumbled. Because you're like, I just want things to make sense. And that's kind of the point. Right? Because one of the big points about this whole chapter is that every single king we talk about, we're talking about 5 of them today, every single one of those kings is an idolater. And every single one of them is in rebellion against God. And so as you read it, it's almost like a rhetorical strategy of the author himself, that he wants you to be left frustrated by the redundancy and frustrated by how confusing it all is and frustrated by just all the different things going on, that it makes you want to pull out your hair. I think that's part of the point. So that then by the time you actually get back to talking about the kings of Judah, you're like, oh, thank God. Or whenever you get to the following chapters where it's talking about the prophet Elijah showing up and calling these people out, you're like, thank you, Elijah. I think that's part of it. But that being said, I'm going to have a difficult time leading us through this, mainly because it's hard for me to keep track of all of these different moving parts here. And so if I misspeak, I just ask that you be gracious with me. So today we are talking about Baasha, Elah, Zimri, Omri, and Ahab, kings of Israel. So 5 kings of Israel back to back. The context of this I can summarize very quickly because we are currently dealing with the divided kingdom of Israel. Right after King Saul, King David, and King Solomon reigned, each for roughly 40 years each, the kingdom split in 2. Right? So we are now dealing with the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. This was largely a punishment towards Solomon because Solomon decided that he was going to multiply horses, multiply wealth, and multiply women, and those women turned his heart against God. Right? So as punishment for this, God gave 10 tribes to this guy named Jeroboam, and he gave 2 tribes, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, to David's grandson, Rehoboam. Right? And we have been tracking basically back and forth. The way that 1 Kings and 2 Kings is structured is that it kind of pinballs back and forth between the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel. The division of the kingdom happened in 1 Kings chapter 12, so we're still fairly early on in that whole history right there. But so far, we have talked about, in the kings of Judah there, Rehoboam, Abijah, and Asa. Right? So we've talked about those first 3 kings, and just so you know, the kings in blue there are the good kings, whereas the kings in gray are bad.
That's what I was going to ask.
Right? Yes. So the kings in gray are bad, and Rehoboam and Abijah, those were no good. Asa, though, he is good. Right? And we talked about him last week, and all the stuff we're talking about today is going to be taking place during Asa's reign. Right? And so, today we're not going to be talking about Judah at all. Today we're going to be moving north, and we're going to talk about the kingdom of Israel. And we are going to talk about King Baasha, Elah, Zimri, Omri, and Ahab. Right? We already talked about Jeroboam and Nadab, and at the end of last week's section, we saw Nadab get killed by a dude named Baasha. Do y'all remember that? Right? So basically, Jeroboam, he was the one that God gave the 10 tribes to. But God made him a promise. He said, basically, if you are faithful to me, then I will make your kingdom endure like I made David's endure. Jeroboam, though, he basically created this whole false religion with 2 golden calves, and he led the people into idolatry. They still claim to worship Yahweh, but this is not Yahweh, right? It's idolatry. And so he turned away from Yahweh, and as a result, God punished him. And he said, your kingdom will not endure. And so Jeroboam had a son named Nadab, who was king for 2 years. But then what we saw at the end of last week's section was that this guy named Baasha came in and killed Nadab, right? So that's where we're currently at. And basically the section that we are in the Bible is what I describe as the Christian Game of Thrones. Because it's literally a Game of Thrones, and that doesn't apply anywhere else more than in the northern kingdom of Israel. Whenever it comes to color coding, what is the thing that you notice with the northern kingdom of Israel?
All gray.
It's all gray. There is not going to be a single good king in the northern kingdom, right? Every single one of these people is simply looking out for themselves and trying to seek power, right? As a result, the northern kingdom is going to go through, I believe, 9 different dynasties over the course of their roughly 200-year tenure, right? They begin to exist as a nation in 931 BC. They're going to be destroyed 210 years later in 722 BC, right? 9 different dynasties, and look how many kings they had over 210 years. By contrast, Israel is going to last almost twice as long. I mean, not Israel, Judah. Judah is going to last almost twice as long. They're going to last roughly 350 years, right? From 931 to 586 BC, right? They have roughly the same amount of kings, and they got some good kings, right? And so the northern kingdom is just political instability from beginning to end, right? It is simply people looking out for themselves, doing evil things. And today we get to talk all about those guys, right? So that's the context. That's where we're at. Let's hop in and actually start talking about it. One thing I did do to try to help us out here is I did go through and I edited these PowerPoints to kind of give us a timeline on the side just to help us kind of make sense of it all. And so what you see on the left here, the blue, those are the kings of Judah, right? And like I said, everything we're covering today is in the timeline of Asa, king of Judah, right? But then if you go to the right, you're going to see roughly when these other guys reigned, right? So we talked about Nadab at the end of last week's, and then we're going to start today by talking about Baasha, and then we're going to talk about Elah, Zimri, Omri, and then at the very end, we're going to talk about Ahab, right? So that's what we're kind of roughly dealing with, and as we go through Kings, I'm going to try to keep this timeline up to date, mainly because, to me, like hopefully this will be as helpful to y'all as it is to me. Because this stuff starts getting really confusing, and a visual aid can be kind of helpful sometimes. Sound good? All right. Let's take it away, Sean.
Okay. In the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, Baasha the son of Ahijah became king over all Israel at Tirzah, and reigned 24 years. And he did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, and walked in the way of Jeroboam and in his sin, which he made Israel sin. Now the word of Yahweh came to Jehu, the son of Hanani, against Baasha, saying, Inasmuch as I exalted you from the dust, and made you ruler over my people Israel, and you have walked in the way of Jeroboam, and have made my people Israel sin, provoking me to anger with their sins, behold, I am going to sweep away Baasha and his house, and I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Anyone of Baasha who dies in the city, the dogs will eat. And anyone of his who dies in the field, the birds of the sky will eat. Now the rest of the acts of Baasha and what he did, and his might, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? And Baasha slept with his fathers, and was buried in Tirzah, and Elah his son became king in his place. Moreover, the word of Yahweh through the hand of the prophet Jehu, the son of Hanani, also came against Baasha and his household, both because of all the evil which he did in the sight of Yahweh, provoking him to anger with the work of his hands, and being like the house of Jeroboam, and because he struck it.
Very good. All right. So we actually hear more about Baasha in the previous chapter, where like it's kind of interesting how like this whole thing's formatted, because whenever we were talking about Asa in the previous chapter, since he was reigning alongside the same time as Baasha, we got to see a lot of Baasha's actions towards Asa, whereas this is actually the section talking about Baasha. So that's what I'm saying, it gets kind of confusing. But what are some things that kind of stick out to y'all just right off the bat as we read through that?
question, I'm sorry.
What are just some things that stick out to y'all? If anything. I mean, it could be that nothing sticks out, but...
So was Jehu a prophet?
Jehu is a prophet, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we will talk about him as we go through this, for sure.
He basically tells Baasha a very similar thing to what he told Jeroboam.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like we see a trend developing, right? Because with Jeroboam, it was like, hey, if you're faithful to me, I'll make your house endure. If you're not, I'll destroy you. And then what we saw is that he wasn't faithful. And so this is where, remember, you saw the prophet, what was it, Ahijah? Mm-hmm. Or Abijah? I think it was Ahijah.
Yeah, I think so.
Ahijah, that's what I'm saying, all the names are similar. Ahijah the prophet confronted Jeroboam and said, you were not faithful, and therefore God is going to destroy you and your entire household. Well, this is like rinse and repeat, right? Different king, different prophet, same message, right? So we're going to see, now it's Jehu approaching Baasha and says, hey, if you'd been faithful, this would have been good, but you weren't. Which is ironic because you would think that they would learn from their predecessors, but they don't. What?
And not being faithful in that time was as simple as like sinning and not doing the sacrifices, right?
So actually, it seems to be more than that. It seems to be, like, it's more and less, right? It's more in the sense of God is demanding more on the heart. It's less because God actually doesn't care as much about the actual sacrifices themselves. I mean, you should be doing those, right? Because that's part of the Torah. But the main thing that God is focusing on throughout all of Kings is the person's devotion to him, right? That is his main thing, right? So there are going to be kings in here who do some pretty terrible stuff. I mean, they are going to be wicked people. But the book will praise them because it says they did not look left or right, but they served Yahweh their whole life, right? So it is simply a matter of not being idolatrous, right? That is really what's happening. But it kind of follows that not being idolatrous goes hand in hand with following the Torah, right? And so the sacrifices should flow from it. Yes. But you will have, eventually we'll start talking about those too. That's not really going to happen until we get to 2 Kings. But once we get to 2 Kings, we are going to talk about God starts sending prophets to the people, like where we have their books, right? You know, like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and them. And a lot of those prophets are criticizing the people because they are going about their sacrifices, but they're not devoted to God. And so actually God says, I don't like your worship. I think your worship stinks. In fact, every time you offer sacrifices, it makes me want to throw up. Because it's almost like knowing your wife is cheating on you and then she comes home and says, I love you every night. It makes you hate those words. Because you're like, no, you don't. Your actions testify the fact that you don't love me. Right? And that's kind of how God begins to feel about their actual practices. But yeah, so it seems like the main focus of 1 and 2 Kings when it comes to faithfulness is literally, did they choose idolatry? Right? To where really God's not asking that much. He's saying, don't bow down before an idol. Don't look to another God. Right? So it's really avoiding idolatry and avoiding paganism. Right? Which are they're usually associated with one another.
Yeah, it's David's integrity of heart.
Exactly, yeah. Being like David. Right? Living like David, that is the charge that is given to every king. Let's walk through it. So in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, Baasha, the son of Ahijah, became king over all Israel at Tirzah and reigned for 24 years. Right? So you can see that of these kings, Baasha's reign is going to last the longest. Right? I mean, the guy before him, Nadab, he lasted 2 years. The guy after him, Elah, is lasting 2 years as well. Right? So Baasha has a pretty good stint as king. And just to put it in chronological territory over here, the kingdom was divided in 931 BC. Right? And so Asa becomes king. That's about 20 years in. Right? Baasha, he is currently about, what would that be, 22 years in? Mm-hmm. So we're not really that far away from the divided kingdom. But notice how many kings the northern kingdom's already gone through. Right? They've already gone through a few different people. Right? They already had Jeroboam, Nadab. They're already on their 3rd king, which I guess is kind of true for the southern kingdom as well. But they're about to go through a whole lot more fairly quickly. Right? And so these kings are going to start dropping like flies. So in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, Baasha, son of Ahijah, became king over all Israel at Tirzah and reigned 24 years. If you're wondering how he became king, all you have to do is go read the previous chapter. Right? I can actually flip there real quick. That way we can recap it. If I could get there. 1 Kings chapter 15. All right, let's see. Where was it at? So Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, became king over Israel in the 2nd year of Asa, king of Judah, and he reigned over Israel for 2 years. He did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, and he walked in the way of his father and in his sin, which he made Israel sin. Then Baasha, the son of Ahijah, of the house of Issachar, conspired against him. And Baasha struck him down at Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines, while Nadab and all Israel were laying siege to Gibbethon. That's a very interesting detail, because Gibbethon is going to come back in this story later on. So, this is in 909 BC. Baasha conspires against Nadab and kills him, right? And then, basically, it's a coup, right? Kill the king, take over his throne. And then it says, so Baasha killed him in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, and reigned in his place. It came about as soon as he was king, he struck down all the household of Jeroboam. You do this because that's how you solidify your dynasty, right? You can't let the king, his family, or any of his friends survive if you want to successfully be king.
Because they'll want revenge, or someone will help them get back in power.
Exactly. He did not leave to Jeroboam any persons alive until he had destroyed them according to the word of Yahweh, which he spoke by his servant Ahijah the Shilonite, and because of the sins of Jeroboam, which he sinned. Right? So that's what we read at the end of last week's section. And so this is picking up right where that left off. Now Baasha is king. And he did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, and walked in the way of Jeroboam, and in his sin, which he made Israel sin. Let's talk about that phrase a little bit. What are y'all's thoughts?
Somehow his sin is making the people that he is governing sin as well.
Yeah. How is that the case?
Well, I was going to ask if it meant, like, because he was king and he was doing evil, does that mean, like, effectively Israel is now all in sin? Or is it because they look to him and they're like, they look to him as their example, and they're like, oh, well, he's sinning, I guess we'll just sin too? Is it the second thing? Is that more means?
I think it's more the second one, for sure.
Yeah.
Yes, sir?
God looks at the kings or the people in charge more than the people that are not.
Well, that's another aspect too, right?
Kind of like what you always say about the teachers, or
Those who teach will be judged more strictly. Yeah. So there is this general principle that usually a people will not rise to be greater than their leaders. Oh, I've got the thing charging. So people will usually not rise to be greater than the leaders. If you want to know about the state of a nation, usually look at the person in charge, right? That'll tell you something about the state of the nation, right? Whenever David is in charge, that says some really good stuff. Whenever you got somebody like Baasha in charge, not looking too hot, right? But like Finn was pointing out, there's also this aspect of the fact that because the guy is the leader, he has a huge influence, right? Whether the king is a good king or not a good king, he nevertheless is a king. And he has that influence, and people are going to look to him, and he is going to kind of set the mood for the whole nation. And so if Baasha is not faithful, it's probably going to be very few people who are actually faithful in Israel, right? And so he is leading people to sin. Another aspect that I think is worth highlighting is that nobody's learning their lesson, right? It's like what's interesting is that all of these people are being put in power by God, right? Like in a second, God is going to take credit for Baasha being on the throne, yet the people themselves do not acknowledge that, right? From their perspective, like Baasha's perspective, from his perspective, I put myself on the throne, right? Why do I owe anything to Yahweh? But we're getting to see a theology behind this book that is asserting that anybody who is placed in power is put there by God, which is something that, the book of Romans is going to defend and stuff like that. And so we have to realize that in governmental systems, and especially in Israel and Judah, if somebody's in charge, it's because God allowed them to be there. And it's because God placed them there, right? But these people are not going to respond to that, right? So Baasha is elevated to this place of power, but that makes him all the more accountable whenever he chooses to not obey God. Because God blessed him and exalted him above men, yet he chose to spit in God's face, right? Which means, okay, with great power comes great responsibility, right? If you hadn't been elevated that high, the fall would not be as far, right? But as a result, he's going to be punished severely.
So pretty much each of these kings on the right, they are the judgment of the king before them. because a lot of them they killed the
In many
women.
ways, yes. Yeah. So usually like the dynasty will last like 1 or 2 people, and then somebody comes in and kills, and that's usually what it is. Right? Basically God will send a prophet and be like, hey, you messed up, you did not learn the lesson, therefore your kingdom will not last. And this really, I mean, this is a pretty good punishment for people, right? Because whenever you're a king, usually, even if you're a power-hungry king, you're not concerned with simply your reign. A big aspect of it is pride, and you want to leave behind a lasting legacy. So what is the best way to punish a king? To wipe out his family, right? Like, and that's like, so that it's a very good punishment, right? Because even if you're a terrible king, sometimes you'll justify it because you're saying, I'm doing it so that my power will be secure, right? And I am doing all these evil atrocities so that my great-grandchildren can still have power. Well, this is God's way of saying, no, that is not, like, you can't justify it that way. Because if you want to stay in power, you're going to be faithful to me. If you're doing evil things, it is purely because you are selfish and self-focused, right? So this is a way of like punishing them to where it's like, okay, you did all that for pride. Well, it's not going to go the way you think it's going to go. So then we go to chapter 16. This is one of those places where the chapter division is just weird. I don't know why I do it that way. Now the word of Yahweh came to Jehu the son of Hanani against Baasha. Now this is something that we did not talk about last week, but Hanani is a prophet that we do read about in the Bible. But he's not mentioned in 1 Kings. He is mentioned in Chronicles, in 2 Chronicles, in the account that we read about Asa. Right? So whenever, like, Hanani was a prophet that was sent to confront Asa, king of Judah, and now Jehu is Hanani's son. So it seems like this was literally just a family of prophets. Right? So Hanani was the prophet, and then now Jehu is also a prophet. But where Hanani went to the kings of Judah, Jehu is going to the kings of Israel. Right? And Jehu is going to he's going to pop up a few times. So he's going to have a pretty long stint as prophet, to where I think it's like, he's going to still be prophesying to kings like 50 years from now, that's a pretty long time, right? So we can assume that Jehu's probably pretty young right here. So the word of Yahweh came to Jehu son of Hanani against Baasha, saying, inasmuch as I exalted you from the dust, and made you ruler over my people Israel, and you have walked in the way of Jeroboam, and have made my people Israel sin, provoking me to anger with their sins, behold, I am going to sweep away Baasha and his house, and I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. Alright, so it seems like there are 2 things God promises to him, and 2 things that he specifically criticizes him for. Right? What is the first thing that he criticizes him for? In verse 2.
Made my people Israel sin, provoking me to anger with their sins.
I would actually argue that those are the second thing. But yes, we will talk about that one. What is the first thing?
Walking in the way of Jeroboam.
No, I would say that still goes with the second one.
Being ruler over my people.
Well, I'm saying, inasmuch as I exalted you from the dust and made you rule over my people. Right? All of that together. The thing that he did wrong is he failed to acknowledge God's role. Right? Because God here is taking credit for it. Right? But as far as we read, Baasha just came in and killed Nadab. Right? But God comes in here, and before he even talks about the explicit sin that Baasha committed, he talks about the implicit one. Right? He says, inasmuch as I exalted you as ruler. Right? Like, that already is the sin, because, like, the way he's living, the follow-up sin, is contrary to what God has done for him. Right? If God raises you up, you better be faithful to God. But he's not being faithful to God, which shows that he's not acknowledging the fact that God raised him up. Right? So the first thing he did wrong is that he is not even acknowledging what God has done for him. And he says, inasmuch as I exalted you from the dust. Right? He said, you were nothing when I found you. Right? You were absolutely nothing, but I made you the ruler. Which is what God does. Right? It's what God did with David. Took him from a shepherd and turned him into a king. It's what he did with Jeroboam. He took him from a servant, turned him into a king. Same thing with Baasha. Took him from dust, turned him into a king. I made you ruler over my people Israel. Yet, here's the second problem. You have walked in the way of Jeroboam and have made my people Israel sin, provoking me to anger with their sins. Right? So what is the main thing he charges them with?
Idolatry?
Idolatry. But what is the... So, From an emotional perspective, what does it seem like God's main concern is here?
Emotional?
Yeah, from an emotional perspective.
He said that he's angry that is it Baasha, right?
Mm-hmm.
That Baasha is not acknowledging him and following him, and instead sinning.
Yes, but to me, it's the fact that says, you have made my people Israel sin. Right? So it'd be one thing if Baasha just went and did this by himself. Right? But that's not what Baasha's doing. Right? Here God elevated him to this position. And what did he do with that? He squandered it. And he used that position to guide God's own people away from God. Right? That's the thing that God cannot stand. That's why God is angry. Right? Because God, we know he's slow to anger. Right? Very slow to anger. And if you choose to go off and just sin on your own, God will hold back his anger as long as he can. But what he will not tolerate is whenever one person leads other people into sin, especially God's own people. Right? This is what Jesus talks about. Right? Woe to you who guide these little children into sin. And woe to you who are a stumbling block. Right? Jesus is not a fan of that. And that's what God's mad about here too. Right? I elevated you to this position, and then you have the audacity to lead my own people away from me. That's unacceptable. Right? It's one thing if you choose to go walk after the way of Jeroboam. It's one thing if you choose to walk after sin. But I elevated you to king. You didn't have that luxury anymore. Your actions are no longer just your own responsibility. Your actions have consequences, and you led an entire nation away from me. And it's not just any nation, it's my nation. Right? It's one thing, like, God could go confront the president of America and say something, but it's not the same. Right? Because America, as much as we like to say we are, we're not God's people. Right? We are simply a people.
A people, yeah.
Yeah. Like, we're just a people.
Like, there
right?
are Jews
Yes.
here.
Yeah, but we are just the Gentiles, right?
Yeah.
Israel, they have a covenant with God, right? They have that. Like, or I guess the better equivalent, even though, once again, the church has not replaced Israel, but it's almost like God giving a person a pastorate, right? To where they are now the pastor of the church. And what do they use for that pastorate? Leading people into idolatry, right? Leading people to not take God's word seriously. That's going to make God really mad. Because he's like, what? I gave you this position, and you should have honored that, right? You should have respected it. But those who teach will be judged more strictly, right? That's what's happening here.
I would say it's also similar, kind of like in the Gospels, whenever Jesus goes to the temple, and there was the one area where the Gentiles were able to worship, and they made it into like a marketplace. Like the one place where someone could come and worship to God, they turned it into something where they couldn't anymore, and that made Jesus really angry. It's kind of like the same idea.
This is supposed to be a house of prayer. You've turned it into a den of thieves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
He flipped the tables.
Yeah. And that really is, like, a lot of times people they mistake why Jesus is mad there. He's not simply mad that it's a market, right? That would have made him mad. But the reason he's mad is because this was the one place where the Gentiles could come worship God. And they had turned it into a marketplace instead. Right? Like, if you go read the passage he's quoting from Isaiah, it says, or it might be Jeremiah, where it says, "This, my house, shall be a house of prayer for all the nations." Mm-hmm. Right? And Jesus says, how dare you? Right? You are supposed to be the best of them. You're supposed to be the light of the world. And people came to you, and you turned them away. He says, that's unacceptable. Right? And that's why Jesus always comes head to head with the religious leaders. Right? It's for the same reason. This is what makes God mad. Whenever he elevates somebody and gives them the privilege of serving him, yet they lead the people astray. So he says, Baasha, you're done. Right? You have made a big mistake. So he's going to do two things. Behold, I am going to sweep away Baasha and his house. Right? So right off the bat, boom, I'm going to get rid of you. And then the second thing is like the first, but it's emphasizing it to an even greater degree. I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. All right, so to sweep away his house implies destruction, but what happened to Jeroboam's house?
He would know.
Yeah, Baasha would know because he's the one who did it, right? I mean, this is ironic, right? Because Baasha knows exactly what happened to Jeroboam's house. Baasha came and killed Jeroboam's son, and then he killed Jeroboam's family, Jeroboam's friends, all of that. Well, guess what's going to happen to Baasha? He's going to have a son, somebody's going to come in, kill his son, and then kill the family and kill the friends. So it's literally copy and paste. As happened to Jeroboam, through you, so will happen to you through somebody else. Right? It's literally like what you sow, you reap.
Yep.
Right? And through all of this, God is saying, I'm ordaining it. Even though the people who are doing it are not going to be doing it for righteous purposes. Right? This is where you just see like the blend of human responsibility and like divine sovereignty working together. Where like Baasha, whenever he killed Nadab, he wasn't doing it for the glory of God. He was doing it because he wanted to kill Nadab. But God ordained it to happen to judge the house of Jeroboam. Right? Same thing going forward. Verse 4, anyone of Baasha who dies in the city, the dogs will eat. And anyone of his who dies in the fields, the birds of the sky will eat. This is the exact same language we saw last week as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Verse 5. Now the rest of the acts of Baasha, and what he did, and his might, are they not written in the books of the chronicles of the kings of Israel? We wouldn't know because we don't have that book. But I'm assuming the answer is yes. And Baasha slept with his fathers, and was buried in Tirzah, and Elah his son became king in his place. I always just find this interesting. Like, you do see like the mercy of God. That it's like, it's never like, he always like waits a generation before the punishment comes. Right? So like, Solomon sinned, and God said, I'm going to punish you, but it was Rehoboam who experienced the punishment. Right? Jeroboam sinned, and God said, I'm going to punish you, but it was Nadab who experienced the punishment. And then here we have Baasha sinning, but it's going to be his son, Elah, who experiences the punishment. Right? I just think it's interesting, like, to where God says, this is what's going to happen, but then the person himself, who God promised it to, isn't the one who experiences it. And it could just be that God is just being merciful, but I think really what God's doing is he's giving them the opportunity to repent. Right? He's not saying, like, because if the person literally is told this when he's alive, and he goes on to die a peaceful death, well, that implies that he had plenty of time in between to repent. But if God announces this and then immediately executes Baasha, well, then where's the opportunity for repentance? But instead, what we see is that this news came to Baasha. He didn't repent. He died. He left behind an idolatrous legacy, and therefore God said, okay, fine. You didn't repent, therefore you'll be wiped out.
Well, I think it also gives their son a chance.
Exactly, right? Yeah, because it's like, hey, just an FYI, I said I was going to do this to Baasha's house. You're the first of that house. So, I'm not doing it to Baasha, but you, I can do it to. Yeah, and so it really is, and that's usually what the role of a prophet is, right? A prophet isn't simply a person predicting the future for the sake of flexing how much he knows the future. A prophet is a messenger declaring the word of God, and he is usually proclaiming judgment in order to guide the people to repentance, right? That is usually the goal, right? And so whenever Nathan came and confronted David, David understood that. Remember, like after the Bathsheba thing? And that's why David spent weeks just like on the ground crying out and saying, God, please be merciful, right? Because he recognized that whenever a prophet confronts you, it's not like a line being drawn in the sand that can't be erased. It's a line being drawn in the sand to say, if you don't repent, this is what's going to happen, right? And David recognizes that that's like prophecy is an invitation to, it's basically God sending somebody to talk to you to invite you to respond, right? It's more of an altar call, right? It's like, all right, get your act together, get to Jesus, right? That's kind of what it's getting at there. So Baasha slept with his fathers, was buried in Tirzah, and Elah his son became king in his place. Tirzah, once again, is the place that is kind of serving as the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel for right now. By the end of this chapter, it is going to have a different capital, which will be the capital through the end of its run. Moreover, the word of Yahweh through the hand of the prophet Jehu the son of Hanani also came about against Baasha and his household, both because of all the evil which he did in the sight of Yahweh, provoking him to anger with the work of his hands, in being like the house of Jeroboam, and because he struck it. So once again, you have that connection with Baasha and Jeroboam. Baasha became the very thing he tried to get rid of. Right? That's like the sad irony of a lot of these stories, is that one of the frustrating aspects of this whole political intrigue thing is that you have all these people who are overthrowing dynasties. And whenever they're doing this, you know that their mindset is, I could do better. Right? That's what they're thinking, right? That's why they would overthrow them, right? Usually, the reason why a coup happens is because people are dissatisfied with the people in charge, and they think, if I was in charge, I could do better. So Baasha, he overthrew Jeroboam's household, because he thought he could be a better king. But he wasn't. He was the exact same. And that's what the author's highlighting. The author highlights, yep, different king, different name, different household, same problems. And another thing worth highlighting here is that, do you notice that the author of 1 Kings isn't highlighting what things are like politically speaking? Like how's the welfare of the people at this time, right? Was the nation prospering? Did they have gold? What did they have? It doesn't mention that, because the author is simply focusing on the spiritual matters of the king, because that's all that matters really, right? Baasha had a super long reign, but the only thing we need to know about him, he wasn't faithful. He was a bad dude, right? And therefore he died, and his son, his dynasty will end with his son, right? And so I think it's really supposed to make you kind of depressed, because you're reading it and you're like, wow, this is what happens whenever man tries to step in the place of God.
And I think that can be related to our question we had, is the will of God.
Uh-huh.
Whether low income, high, medium, or high, what matters is, are you doing his will that he's already laid out?
Yeah. Well, because once we get to the Old Testament prophets,
Whatever job it is.
there are several times where they confront kings, and when you actually look at the archaeology and other historical facts about those kingdoms, they are reigning in times of prosperity, right? I mean, it's like the not literally, but the streets are metaphorically paved in gold, right? Like everything's doing great, there's peace in the land, everything's awesome. Yet the prophets show up and they rebuke them, and they now, whenever we think of the Old Testament prophets, we just think that the kingdoms are falling apart constantly and that everybody's poor and everybody's oppressed. But that's not what the prophets are saying. The prophets are saying, yeah, your streets may be lined with gold, but how many people did you have to cheat in order to line those streets with gold? Yes, there might be some wealthy people in this nation, and there might be a strong middle class, but how many people did you have to impoverish in order to get there? How many gods did you have to bow down to in order to get there? How many sins did you have to embrace? Right? That's what the prophets are getting on to them about, right? Because they're like, yes, physically y'all are doing great. So was Solomon, right? Solomon's greatest sin came when he was at the height of his prosperity, right? And so the author doesn't really focus much on how the nations are prospering, because from his perspective, he's already proven that prosperity doesn't prove much, right? He proved that with Solomon. Solomon's receiving 666 talents of gold every year. And what does he do? Turn away from God. And so prosperity is not everything, right? Despite what many preachers would have you think. All right, moving on. Let's talk about the next king.
In the 26th year of Asa, king of Judah, Elah, the son of Baasha, became king over Israel at Tirzah, and reigned 2 years. And his servant Zimri, commander of half his chariots, conspired against him. Now he was at Tirzah, drinking himself drunk in the house of Arzah, who was over the household at Tirzah. Then Zimri went in and struck him, and put him to death in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, and became king in his place. Now it happened, when he became king, as soon as he sat on his throne, that he struck down all the household of Baasha. He did not leave one that pisses against the wall, not even any of his kinsmen, redeemers, or his friends. Thus Zimri destroyed all the household of Baasha, according to the word of Yahweh, which he spoke against Baasha by the hand of Jehu the prophet, for all the sins of Baasha and the sins of Elah his son, which they sinned and which they made Israel sin, provoking Yahweh, the God of Israel, to anger with their idols. Now the rest of the acts of Elah and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel?
Very good. So there's Elah's 2-year reign. Ironically, Elah in his 2 years gets roughly the same amount of coverage that Baasha got with almost 22 years, right? And so that's interesting.
They died.
Well, that's what I'm saying. And that's why I'm saying this chapter is so frustrating. Because you read it, and most of it, you're almost wondering, what can I elaborate on in this section? Because it's almost the same exact thing, right? It's almost it's just evil, begetting evil, begetting evil, begetting evil. And I think that's the point. I think that, gone are the days where you get to see exciting stories of, shepherds taking down giants. Gone are the days where you get to see about, kings dedicating temples with amazing prayers. Now we're in the redundant days of idolatry, right? Life is actually more exciting whenever you're faithful to God, right? You might...
Ask Asa.
What's that?
I said, just ask Asa. He's got a big blue line.
Well, exactly, right? I mean, look at this. This dude, he is a good king, and he is having a long reign, and he is thriving. Meanwhile, this kingdom over here is falling apart because they're all choosing to sin. Like he's got, I imagine Asa's over here watching the northern kingdom fall apart. And he's like, yeah, I'm just going to keep following God over here.
I mean, even Judges had more exciting stories, but...
Well, that's what I'm saying.
By this point, it's just kind of like old.
Well, it's old news.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, I mean, everybody knows the fall of man's story because that's the first time man chose sin. Wow, it's exciting. It's something new. And then everybody knows Cain and Abel because that's the first time somebody like murdered somebody. And then everybody knows about like the flood because that's when it got so bad that God had to send a flood. But then eventually it's like, I don't know, the same evil gets redundant, right? It's like, okay, another person killed another dude, and then somebody slept with another person. Like, it's just like, oh my gosh, it's just evil, evil, evil. Like, it finally gets to the point where you're just really excited to just see something good, right? I just started showing Brienne the show Ted Lasso, right? Have you ever seen Ted Lasso?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, do you know the reason why Ted Lasso became so popular? It's because this main character is just an overwhelmingly positive character. And... like, people, like honestly, the show itself it's kind of a strange show because, like, I'm not a sports fan, and it's just a show about soccer. I normally would never gravitate towards it, but there's something attractive about the show just because the main character is so positive. And this show has won all sorts of awards because I think for the first time, people are watching a show and they're like, wow, it's just kind of refreshing to experience something that isn't overtly negative. Like, everything is stacked against this guy, and he's just optimistic. Right? And once again, it's not a Christian show. There is cussing out the wazoo, and it's not like the dirtiest show in the world or anything like that. But people, like, whenever you hear people talk about it, they're like, I just love how positive it is. Right? But it's because we're so accustomed to hearing stories of negative things. Right now, I mean, even our superheroes have to be edgy nowadays. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, these people who are supposed to inspire hope, now it's like, ooh, well, here's the real story of how people would react in a real world where it's grim and dark. It's like, guys... like, we just want a little bit of positive stuff, right? And that's kind of how the author of 1 Kings seems to feel. Because it's like, yeah, you know what? Back in Genesis, sins were, at least it was like, okay, well, this is something new. And even in Judges, it was like, okay, well, things got so bad there that there were some wild stories. But now we're in 1 Kings, and we're like, okay, now there are kings in Israel, and people are still doing what's right in their own eyes. I mean, they didn't even learn the lesson, right? I mean, like, it's like, at least in Judges, they didn't have a king. Right? Back in Judges, they at least had an excuse. Now, what do they have? They have no excuse because the kings are being killed off because they're doing what's right in their own eyes, and the other kings don't learn the lesson. It's like, what exciting stories are there to tell? It's just the redundancy of idolatry, right? Which, applicationally speaking, is true in our own lives as well, right? You see all these people who, I don't know, I guess they look on social media and stuff, and they're like, oh man, like, I just, I see this a lot with my high schoolers, right? They're like, I can't wait to get out of private school. I'm going to go, and I'm going to, like, get away from my parents, and I'm just going to, like, go party and do all this stuff. And I'm like, you see people who are college-aged doing those things. Have you ever talked to somebody who's 40 years old who did those things when they were in college? Because they would probably tell you those were not good decisions to make, right? That's why your parents tell you not to do them, right? But the thing is, they're not learning from their lessons. And it ends up just being the same thing, right? It's like you think that you're being unique and going out and partying and drinking, but no, you're not. You're simply being like everybody else, right? You think you're being unique and going and like cheating on your spouse. No, you're not. You're just giving in to the inclinations that every human being would have, right? Like you think that you're making your life really complex by adding all this stress to it and having all these hidden sins. No, you're simply complicating things for no reason whatsoever. If you want to actually have a truly exciting life, grow in sanctification. Right? It'll be a lot more challenging, and it'll be a lot more rewarding.
Striving against the evil of the world.
Right? Yeah, going against the current. Who wants to watch like a video of a fish like just swimming with the current? No, give me a video of a fish swimming against the current, and I don't even care about fish, but I'll watch that. Right? Because I just want to see it happen.
Oh yeah, like when
right?
they did, I saw that one time. They're talking about their like mating season. They have to like go up a current and then lay the eggs.
Yeah. Well, and that's why we like underdog stories, right? It's because we have somebody going against the flow, right? And honestly, that's why we like stories in general. Right? The reason why we like good characters is because they're different from everybody else, right? They're set apart, right? Whenever, like, that's why, like, there's that whole trend, I'm not your normal, ordinary girl. Like, it's because if you want a compelling character, they have to be different. And whenever they're not different, you get 1 Kings chapter 16. Okay, Elah showed up, and he was like Baasha, who was like Nadab, who was like Jeroboam. And he's going to be like Omri, and Zimri, and Ahab. Right? They're all the same. Right? There's just different flavors of the sameness. Right? And then here and there, there'll be an exceptional story to talk about, but more or less it's just, let me just tell you what you need to know so we can get to the next guy. Right? We can talk about all these 5 at one time because they're all the same. So in the 26th year of Asa, king of Judah, Elah the son of Baasha became king over Israel at Tirzah. And he reigned for 2 years. 2. Woo! He lasted half of a term of a president. Good job. And his servant Zimri, commander of half of his chariots, conspired against him. Destroyed from within. So Zimri rises up. He's just, I guess, he's one of his soldiers. This usually is how it kind of goes, right? You have a guy who's like a hardened battle warrior, and he knows how to command a battlefield, so he thinks he knows how to command a nation better, right? And so he's like, ha! I got this. And so he rises up against Elah, and it says, now he was at Tirzah drinking himself drunk in the house of Arza, who was over the household of Tirzah. I love that it shares that detail, because I think that is supposed to just be a summary of what Elah was like as a king. What is he doing?
Drunk all the time.
He's just at home getting drunk, right? He's just at somebody's house partying, right? This is what this guy is, right? He's nothing notable. He is just a king being a worldly king, right? He is using his power for excesses, right? He's not out on the battlefield. He is not out on diplomatic missions. He's not doing what David did and, saying like, wow, God has put me in this position. Who can I show kindness to? He's simply in a place getting drunk. And usually that is not a place, like, usually whenever people go and start just drinking together, that usually doesn't set up, like, good choices and stuff. So, he was at Tirzah, in the capital city, getting drunk in the house of Arza, who was over the household of Tirzah. It's also probably a thing, like, once again, the Bible does not condemn alcohol. It does condemn drunkenness. But I would say, in general, for leaders, there's an even higher expectation. Because if anybody needed to be truly sober-minded, it would be a leader. Right? And so I think that there is kind of like this expectation that, leaders, like, just stay away from anything that will keep you from full sobriety. Right? Because you are, especially a leader of God's people. Right? You need to be on your A game all the time. What's this guy doing? He's wasted. Right? It's a picture of a kind of embarrassing king. You kind of almost understand why Zimri wants to rise up against him. Because you're like, wow, this is the king we have? He's 2 years into his reign and he's already getting drunk in a person's house. How long did it take for him to start doing that? Probably not long. Right? He probably started doing this when he was still the prince, when Baasha was reigning. So Zimri went in and struck him and put him to death in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, and he became king in his place. So that lets you know that apparently his reign was even less than 2 full years. Because he started his 2-year reign in the 26th year of Asa, and he ended it in the 27th year. Right? So if you just look at that, we're probably talking about a year and a half-ish. Right? So the dude's drunk, probably doesn't even know what hit him. Right? He's just chilling out at the house, he's drinking, partying, not sober at all. And then, Zimri, his chariot commander, comes in. He's like, hey, Zimri, what you doing, man? Put that sword up. Not in me. And so Zimri kills him. Right? Once again, this is super unstable. Right? I mean, we are 5 kings in now, right? Is that correct? Jeroboam, Nadab, Baasha, Elah, now Zimri. We are 5 kings in and 3 dynasties in. Right? The average dynasty so far has lasted 2. Right? And when I say average, I mean both dynasties have lasted 2 people. Right? But we're going to get shorter than that, because guess how many people Zimri's dynasty is going to last? 1. Guess how long Zimri's reign is going to last?
Oh, it was 1 year.
1 week.
Oh.
It's going to last 1 week. I kid you not. This dude will be like 7 days from him striking down Elah. This dude's also going to die. Wild. Right? Like, this is how the Northern Kingdom is, and this is the instability of a life of sin. Right? I mean, think about it. I mean, if you just practically think about this also in your own life, right? Whenever you go and live a life of sin, it naturally makes your life more unstable, right? If you are out cheating on your wife, you are naturally going to just be more stressed out because you are constantly having to conceal that. And it is going to make the rest of your life hectic. If you add to that you're going and partying all the time, and if you add to that you are a thief, you're adding all these sins that are just overcomplicating your life. You actually make your life a lot simpler and less chaotic by just being faithful, right? I mean, over here you got the northern kingdom falling apart, and you got Asa just like chilling out. Like Asa in Judah is just like, wow. Like he just has his popcorn and he's just watching these people just destroy themselves.
What's that one, like, I don't know if it's actually a Mark Twain quote, but it's like about like with like lying and like being truthful. It's like with the lie, you have to keep like remembering what you were told people and stuff.
Yeah.
And eventually you get caught in the lie.
Yeah, it's simpler to just tell the truth. Yeah. But for some reason we like our hearts crave evil, right? We yearn to go to this path, and we always think we're going to be the exception. Yes, I'm going to embrace this sin, but it's okay for me, not for anybody else. No. You're just not thinking correctly. Yes, sir.
That's why your sin doesn't just affect you, it affects everybody around you.
Yeah.
We think, when we sin, it's just affecting us. No, it isn't. It's affecting everyone you come into contact with.
Yeah, I mean, here we're laughing at what's happening to these kings, but you have to realize that because of their sin, the northern kingdom is suffering. And the people who are supposed to be devoted to God are serving other gods, right? And so, yeah, your sin affects other people. And so it's easy for us to laugh at this, but imagine you were living in a country that was this chaotic, right? To where a president was elected in 2 years, killed. And then the person who killed him, 7 days later, killed by another person. You'd be like, whoa, like this is not a good time to live, right? Yeah. So Zimri went in and struck him and put him to death in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, and he became king in his place. Now it happened when he became king, as soon as he sat on his throne, which I imagine was that very same day, that he struck down all the household of Baasha. He did not leave one that pisses against the wall, not even any of his kinsmen redeemers or his friends. There's that phrase that we talked about a few weeks ago, pisses against the wall. This is just like a kind of crude way of referring to men, right? He didn't leave a single male in his household alive. Most Bible translations will translate it as men, just for the sake of being polite. But I prefer that translation because that's what it literally says. And if the author was trying to be polite, there was a word for men he could have used. I think that the author is trying to be crude on purpose because there's a time and place for crude language, right? I know a lot of times we don't like that as Christians. Like we like to sanitize everything. But if you read the Old Testament and read like the prophets, you realize that there's a time and place for crude language. I think we should be very sparing with that, and I'm not confident enough to know when those times are, but there is a time, right? And so the author says that Baasha didn't leave anybody alive, nobody who pisses against the wall, right? So maybe he let some of the women live, right? But the women aren't the threat. He kills all the men, and it says he takes out the kinsmen redeemers. What's a kinsman redeemer?
Oh, it's like a cousin, isn't it?
Well, basically it's any relative that could have then married the women to provide a future heir.
Like what Boaz was.
Yeah, it's what Boaz was to Ruth, right? And so what we see here is that he's really just making sure that these people cannot have any heirs, right? Because that is what the threat to the throne would be, right? He's killing immediate relatives. Those are the men who piss against the wall. And then he's also killing the kinsmen redeemers, right? Any other family members who might have been able to marry the widows to produce heirs. Because if you produce an heir, well, then Elah has an heir to the throne, and you also have people who could be mad and come kill you as a result. And in addition to that, he even kills the friends, right? Might as well, hey, I saw you hanging out with Elah a few days ago. You're dead. Hey, did I see you, smile at Elah from across the street? Dead. Why is he doing this?
Any threats? Get rid of threats.
Yeah, he's covering all his bases, right? I want to make sure that my kingdom lasts forever. It's going to last 1 week. I just think that's funny. Like, he's going out of his way to be like, I want to make sure this goes on a long time. Also, just to live in such a nation just sounds so terrible, right? Imagine it's like every time a king rises to power, like entire families are just massacred.
Those
Like,
are
I mean,
people's neighbors. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, and like also like just the nature of the kings. Like we're so like this is something that we take for granted as Americans because like we have democracy, right? We vote for people to be in power. That's not how things worked back then. It was literally like might is right, right? It's like okay, if you have the power, you can be in charge, right? Like if you have enough strength, and if you overthrow these people, you could be the new king. So it's like all right, and then if people like you, well maybe your son can be king. If they don't like you, better watch out. Somebody's going to come kill you and take over. Right? Like, in our nation, if somebody, like, you know, we've had presidents be killed, but the next person, like, it's not the person who kills the president who gets to be in charge, right? That'd be terrible. But that's how it was back then, right? I mean, like, that's how monarchies would work, right? It's like, okay, well, you overthrew the government. I guess you're the one taking over. Like, in America, we have different procedures. It's like, well, no, you're a murderer. You're going to prison. Here, it's like, you won. I guess you're in charge now. Like, that's terrifying, right? Like, just living in a culture like that has got to be scary. But if you go to the southern kingdom of Judah, God made a promise to David, and so every single king will be from David's line. So it's just stable, right? In Judah, it's less political instability and it's more spiritual instability, right? To where you always know where the king's going to come from. You just don't know what God you're going to serve, right? Whether the king is good or bad. Thus Zimri destroyed all the household of Baasha, according to the word of Yahweh, which he spoke against Baasha by the hand of Jehu the prophet. So this fulfilled exactly what the prophet said, right? The prophet predicted it to Baasha, and it was fulfilled to Elah. For all the sins of Baasha and the sins of Elah his son, which they sinned, in which they made Israel sin, provoking Yahweh the God of Israel to anger with their idols. We see here that Elah followed in Baasha's sin, right? So it wasn't simply that Elah was punished on Baasha's behalf. We see that, no, Elah had also followed in the footsteps of his father, right? So he likewise did not sin. Now the rest of the acts of Elah and all that he did, are they not written in the books of the chronicles of the kings of Israel? To which we say, I guess so. I don't know. Probably.
Isn't that Chronicles?
No, the book of Chronicles would be the Chronicles of the kings of Judah. Because if you read 1st and 2nd Chronicles in our Bible, it only talks about the kings of Judah. And we don't know for sure if our book of Chronicles is the same thing that Kings is referencing whenever it says the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, but we would assume so, right? It might be an updated version of it because it seems like the book of Chronicles probably was completed later than Kings, but it might just be like the same thing with like some added information or something in there.
Okay, so 1st and 2nd Kings are the closest thing we have to what they're talking about. They're Chronicles of the Kings of Israel.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, because 1st and 2nd Kings details both the kings of Israel and Judah, right? Whereas Chronicles just details Judah, right? And so really Chronicles is like a condensed version of it, right? So it'll go into more detail about each of the kings and stuff like that. All right, so we move on to the next part.
In the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, Zimri reigned 7 days at Tirzah. Now the people were camped against Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines. And the people who were camped heard it said, Zimri has conspired and has also struck down the king. Therefore all Israel made Omri, the commander of the army, king over Israel that day in the camp. Then Omri and all Israel with him went up from Gibbethon and besieged Tirzah. Now it happened that when Zimri saw that the city was captured, he went into the citadel of the king's house and burned the king's house over him with fire, and died, because of his sins which he sinned, doing what is evil in the sight of Yahweh, walking in the way of Jeroboam, and in his sin which he did, making Israel sin. Now the rest of the acts of Zimri and his conspiracy which he carried out, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel?
That's just embarrassing, honestly. 1 week, right? This guy's, that's the shortest reign that we're going to get here. But yeah, 1 week, right? I mean, think about all the stuff he had to do, right? He literally, he probably spent longer than a week planning how he was going to kill the previous king. Right? I would hope he spent more than a week to undertake something like that. And his dynasty lasts 1 week, right? If that isn't a picture of the fleeting pleasures of sin, I don't know what is, right? I mean, here he had this long plan, and he enjoyed it for a week. And then notice that it's not anybody else who, nobody kills him. What happens?
Kills
He kills himself.
So
Right?
they were fighting the Philistines, and the people at the camp heard that Zimri took over, and they put the general that was at the camp in charge. They were like, "You're gonna be king now."
Yeah.
And they went and got the capital.
Uh-huh.
Okay. And then Zimri went to his house, where the king is supposed to
Yeah.
stay, and burned it down on him.
Yeah.
On himself.
So basically he kills himself.
Okay.
It's like,
Yes.
oh crap.
Well, yeah. He's like, wow, I thought people would react more positively to this. This did not go as planned. And it's kind of like if I can't be king, nobody can be king. So he's like, I'm taking the house down with me. Yeah, it's kind of a petty move, if you ask me. Yeah, like, well, I guess it's also like, I'm going to die on my own terms, right? That's kind of what he's going for here. But yeah, so...
Oh, I guess he would figure the next step would be they're gonna come kill me, but...
Yeah, and he didn't want to suffer. He's like, I'll just do this to myself.
Yeah, okay.
But yeah, so in the 27th year of Asa, once again, Asa is still in charge over there. Like, Asa's just chilling over in Judah while all hell is breaking loose in Israel. In the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, Zimri reigned 7 days at Tirzah. Like, that's just like, every time I read it, it just blows my mind because to me it's almost like, why did the author even include this? Like, it's like, you could have easily just like skipped over it and been like, oh yeah, Zimri killed this one dude, but it was Omri who took over, right? Like, you could easily just say that and not mention this at all. But I think that this is just the author once again highlighting Israel is just falling apart. Like, this is what idolatry does, right? It's like, it gets very redundant. And then the most exciting story is how fleeting pleasures of sin can be, right? It's like, oh, you want something really exciting? There was this one dude, he reigned for a week. Crazy, huh? It's like, oh, that's the exciting story? Yeah, it was it's amazing how short-lived that pleasure was.
It may be that they're supposed to record it because, like you said, that's how kings were changed.
Well, yeah,
So
yeah.
it had to be recorded that it went to him and then to him. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just funny to me because it's like, it's so short, it's like, you could have easily just skipped over it. Because it's like, I don't know, it's kind of like whenever somebody, like, I don't know, whenever I'm like talking to like my high schoolers, they're like, yeah, I've had 5 girlfriends. It's like, oh yeah? How long have I been dating? We've been dating for like a week, and that's my longest relationship so far. And you're like, all right, it's like, okay, if you dated for less than a week, does that actually count? Like, it's like,
Are they proud of this?
yes, yeah, it's crazy. But I'm saying, like, that's the bad thing, right? There are high school relationships that last longer than this dude's reign. Like, that is sad. So in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, Zimri reigned 7 days at Tirzah. Now the people were camped against Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines. Remember, we talked about Gibbethon before, right? Gibbethon was the place where they were camped at back whenever we saw, what was it? Baasha struck down Nadab, right? That was back in 909 BC, and now here we are, and it is the year 885, right? So this is, 24 years later? And they're still encamped over at Gibbethon. I'm assuming that there's just been like, it probably wasn't a 24-year-long battle, but it just seems like it was probably like they kept coming back to this place, right? And it might also once again highlight the redundancy of it all, right? New king, new dynasty, same old enemies, same old battle, right?
And with them not being faithful, they're not winning the battles.
Well, exactly, right? I mean, there's no progress either way. It's like
20 years and no progress has been made.
Yeah.
Just like they're just like spiritually too.
yeah, and all we're going to see is that the Philistines start making progress in a bit, right? So, yeah, they're stagnant. They're the same. Nothing's changing. So the people who were camped there heard Zimri has conspired and has also struck down the king, right? So they're just over here chilling on like their encampment, and they hear news. Hey, did you hear that apparently there's a new king in town? And they're like, oh, we don't like Zimri. Hey, Omri, how about you? I mean, your name at least doesn't start with the last letter of the alphabet. It's like, I don't know, there's like, that was a joke, by the way. Yeah, okay. I need more laughter. Come on, give me some feedback. All right. Note to self, get better jokes. Therefore, all Israel made Omri, the commander of the army, king over Israel that day of the camp. Do you see also how it just seems like subjective? They're just like, we don't like that king. We'll take another one. It's like, try again. Like that, they've just gotten used to it, right? They've gotten used to like there not being like a set system, right? It's like, we don't like this king, we'll just overthrow him. Well, these guys, they haven't even given Zimri a chance, right? They're like, nah, I don't like Zimri. Let's just kill him too, right? It's like this is just the state of their political system. It has gotten so bad that they're like, nah, we think Omri would be better. We'll get rid of Zimri and we'll try again. It's like, wow, this is so depressing. It's like, just no faith in the system whatsoever. Before Zimri's even had a chance to be king, they're like, no, we don't think so. We want somebody else.
That's literally just like the whole entire second half of like Roman history too. Just like someone becomes emperor, and then like some army, like a legion, they'll just declare the general emperor, and then like they'll either like kill themselves, or the guards kill them because they're like, yeah, you're not living.
Yeah, like isn't that ridiculous?
Yeah, it's just all the infighting.
Yeah, and like it's funny nowadays because we talk about like how sinful culture is nowadays, but the more you study history, the more you realize
it's been like this.
It's been worse, honestly, in many places. Like, yes, I think that it's very problematic that we don't know how to define the difference between a man and a woman. That is new. That is something that is pretty crazy for the current culture. But when you look at broader history, you're like, politically speaking, we live in pretty stable times. I mean, like, this was commonplace. Like, this isn't just happening in tiny little Israel. It's happening in the Roman Empire and stuff. Like, this is just, that's how it is.
We've got bad, like, spiritual and, like, head stuff going on, but, like, it's not as bad.
We've invented new forms of evil.
Yeah.
But we are still the same human hearts, right? Like that's what it is. So therefore, all Israel made Omri the commander of the army, king of Israel. I just love I love how simple it says it. It doesn't say they conspired against it. It's like they heard, hey, Zimri made himself king, and they're like, so Omri, you're king now. And it's like, wait, but we just heard that Zimri was. No, not my king. That's not my truth. All right, they're like, no, Zimri's not my king. Omri's my king. They just
hashtag not my king.
Yeah, hashtag not my king. Oh gosh, that's wow, that's so relevant. No, but I just love just in my head. This is just a funny moment because it's literally just all these guys encamped at battle. And once there's no Google or anything like this, right? There's no news, right? So all these interactions are happening. Like here, everybody throughout the land is hearing that Zimri is now king. These soldiers over here have just received this news, and I just imagine them hearing the news. I don't know how it went. I just imagine them hearing this news, and they all just collectively look at one another and we're like, nah. Because they're familiar with Zimri because he's the head of the chariots, right? So they all know who Zimri is, and they're like, And they look at Omri, they're like, you want to be the king? And so here, while everybody else is still receiving the news that Zimri is now king, these guys have already appointed another king to where now that news is going to have to spread everywhere as well. So it's like
the whole 7 days he was king was just the time for the news to reach.
Exactly. Just imagine being an Israelite in this time period. It's like a messenger comes to your door. We have a new king, Zimri. And then the next day, all right, plot twist, we're going to get rid of Zimri and Omri's king now. It's like what? It's just so terrible. Then Omri and all Israel went up with him from Gibbethon and besieged Tirzah. Right? They're like, all right, we know how to do this, right? They stand a better chance against their own people than they do against the Philistines. Right? They're like, all right, well, we've been fighting the same battle for 24 years. Let's just go besiege the capital. Right? Just it's a simple thing. This is it's so terrible. This is somebody storming the White House and just overthrowing everything. Oh, can you go? Yeah. So it happened when Zimri saw that the city was captured, he went into the citadel of the king's house and burned the king's house over him with fire, and he died. Okay, Joseph. Yeah. So whenever Zimri sees what's going on here, he realizes that he is basically screwed, and he says, all right, well, this did not go as planned. I guess I'm going to go down the house. I guess you could say that Zimri literally fired himself. Got him. Yeah. So Zimri. So I wish I could take credit for that. I took that from somebody else. I have to give credit where credit's due.
Still solid.
Still solid. It was the solid delivery. So it happened. Zimri saw the city was captured. He went to the citadel of the king's house, burned the king's house over himself with fire, and died. So Zimri, this is just so pathetic to me. This one story is just. I shouldn't get so much entertainment out of a person offing himself, right? That's horrible. But I think just the whole thing is such a pathetic picture of like Israel at this time period that I can't help but laugh. And I think the author, once again, might want you to feel that way. It's like dark humor. Like, here this guy, like, he had huge aspirations. He's like, I'm going to kill the king. I'm going to be the best king ever. He, like, takes over the place. He's sitting on his throne. He's, like, just getting settled in. He just spread the news that he's the king. He looks out the city, and he sees that an army is surrounded him that he's captured. He's like, dang. It's like, well, and nobody's coming to his defense. He knows he's going to be overthrown. It's literally his own army fighting against him. He's like, well, it was a good run. And he just burns down the house with himself in it. Like, if that's not the most pathetic story about a king, I don't know what is.
Now, I like how it says in verse 20 how it describes his acts and leadership as conspiracy.
Yeah.
Just to show like how evil he was.
Yeah. All of these guys are just so bad. They're just so horrible. But I don't know, just that imagery of him just like, bring the house down. Just like, it just reminds me of, like, you know that meme where it's like the cartoon character who's just like in the house that's on fire and he's like, this is fine. I'm fine.
Yeah.
Everything's fine. That's Zimri. Right? Zimri's just sitting there like, it was a good run. I was king for a week. And
Like, all right, boys. Peace.
peace out. Good luck, Omri.
My body's about to be burned.
So it happened that he burned the house down and he died. It also reminds me a little bit of Samson, other than the fact that Samson at least killed Philistines, whereas the Philistines are still alive over there while Zimri's being killed. And he died because of the sins which he had sinned, doing what is evil in the sight of Yahweh, walking in the way of Jeroboam, and in his sin which he did, making Israel sin. So this dude's dynasty lasted one person. We are now 5 kings into the history of the people of Israel, and we've had 3 dynasties. You do the math there, these are not very long-lasting dynasties. 1 week, that's just baffling. He lasted a week. Like, talk about lack of preparation. Like, if you cannot make your, like, I know I need to move on past this, but just thinking about that, it's like, wow. Like, the lack of, like, I feel like I could overthrow something and make it last longer than a week. Like, that's just baffling to me. I mean, probably not. I'd probably last like 6 hours. But now the rest of the acts of Zimri and his conspiracy which he carried out, are they not written in the books of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? To which we once again say, I'm assuming so. Yeah. We move on. Let's talk about Omri.
Then the people of Israel were divided into 2 parts. Half of the people followed Tibni the son of Ginath to make him king. The other half followed Omri. But the people who followed Omri prevailed over the people who followed Tibni the son of Ginath. And Tibni died, and Omri became king. In the 31st year of Asa king of Judah, Omri became king over Israel and reigned 12 years. He reigned 6 years at Tirzah. And he bought the hill Samaria from Shemer for 2 talents of silver. And he built on the hill, and he named the city which he built Samaria, after the name of Shemer, the owner of the hill. And Omri did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, and acted more wickedly than all who were before him. For he walked in all the way of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and in his sins which he made Israel sin, provoking Yahweh, the God of Israel, to anger with their idols. Now the rest of the acts of Omri which he did, and his might which he showed, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? So Omri slept with his fathers, and was buried in Samaria, and Ahab his son became king in his place.
Very good. Thank you.
Finally, a successful dynasty.
So you have-
somewhat.
It's going to be a successful dynasty, but still just as evil. Well, worse. Yes, sir?
So you have another person, the same day, or I guess the same week that they went, Omri became, they appointed.
I know, right? Isn't that crazy?
So
Like,
it's 3 guys in 1 week.
yeah, like that's wild, right? So you got Zimri who appoints himself king. A week later, he is killed because people put another person as king. And then this dude's getting ready to sit on his throne, and another dude shows up and is like, "I want the throne." And it's like, what? Like, and then the civil war breaks out. This is so politically unstable.
I don't know why. Why didn't you mention Tibni in the thing?
Because he never really ends up counting as a king.
Okay.
Like, it was more like he was he was fighting for the role, but since Omri won out, we don't really count him in there. Like, if you look him up, like, people will debate about this. I'll talk about, there's some chronological issues that we're going to have to deal with in a second in this part. But Yeah. So one thing to highlight here is that Omri and his son Ahab, in many ways, the author of 1 Kings seems to be presenting them as like the anti-Davidian dynasty, right? To where Omri, if you look at the details we see about him, he is almost like the anti-David. And Ahab is going to be like the anti-Solomon, right? And it's almost like they're going to be undoing the conquest that David and Solomon completed, right? So, and I'll highlight what I mean by that. So, then the people of Israel were divided into two parts. Half of them followed after Tibni, the son of Ginath, who we don't know where this dude came from. He just popped up out of nowhere, and it's like, all right, I guess he's wanting the throne too. So half of the people followed Tibni, son of Ginath, to make him king. The other half followed Omri. I mean, this is really pathetic, right? So we already have all of Israel being divided into two kingdoms, and then now we have the northern kingdom being divided into two as well, right? This is a civil war within the middle of a civil war. Like, this is so bad, right? Like, you cannot get worse than this. I mean, you can. It's going to get worse. But this is a new low, right? It's just continually getting worse. This is where we begin to see that there is this trend between Omri and David, right? Because think about it. Omri is following up this kid. Like, so basically, people came and elevated Omri to king after the previous king killed himself. Well, that's what people did with David, right? People took David and elevated him to king over Judah after Saul killed himself. But remember, David was only made king over Judah because there was civil war in the land, right? Remember, David was king over Judah for 7 years. And then after Ishbosheth and Abner were out of the way, he became king over all Israel for 33 years, right? And so the beginning of David's reign also was a time of civil war. Well, same thing with Omri, right? And so you've got a king who is elevated to kingship by the people after the death of a previous king by suicide, and he's beginning his reign during a time of civil war. And it's not going to stop there, right? There's going to be more things in addition to that, right? But you already have these parallels here. But where David was faithful to Yahweh, and he was the height of the kingdom, we're going to see Omri bringing the people into even greater depravity. He is going to establish something that is very long-lasting and stable compared to what's preceded it, kind of like David established something stable after Saul, but it's going to be more wicked, right? But the people who followed Omri prevailed over the people who followed Tibni, the son of Ginath, and Tibni died, and Omri became king. Okay, well, just like David's people prevailed over Saul's people, right, or Ishbosheth's people, and after Ishbosheth died, then David became king over the whole land. Well, in the same way with Omri, right? Omri's guys won, Tibni died. It doesn't tell us how Tibni died, but Omri became king, right? So now Omri is, once again, comparable to David. This is where we get the chronological issue, right, that we have to wrestle through, and we're not going to spend too much time on it because I don't think I have the answers. I'll give you my ideas. But it says, in the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, Omri became king over Israel and reigned 12 years. He reigned 6 years at Tirzah. All right. Here's the issue. It says that Omri became king in the 31st year of Asa, right? But the previous king, how long did the previous king reign? Zimri. How long did he reign? 1 week. 7 days, right? Well, if you go to the previous slide, it says in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, Zimri reigned 7 days. So in the 27th year, Zimri reigned 7 days. But in the 31st year, it says that Omri became king. But when you're working chronologically through it, when you get to the next king, it assumes that it almost like Omri's reign started in the 27th year, right? And so my guess here is that what the author is suggesting is that the civil war between Tibni and Omri lasted 4 years, but whenever he says that Omri reigned 12 years, he's including those 4 years in the reign, right? So really he reigned 8 years, or sorry, I'm getting this on the, yes. So he reigned 8 years after having won the civil war, but it was 12 years total, right? Does that make sense? That's my best way of reconciling it. But it also could just be that the word 31st there is like a manuscript error, right? But this is one of those places where that there is some difficulty with it whenever you're trying to reconcile the different things, because you don't jump from the 27th year to the 31st year in 1 week, right? And so we're trying to figure that out, but it seems like the most likely case is that there was a 4-year civil war, but his 12-year reign is including those 4 years, right? So 8 years after the Civil War. But, yeah. Do with that what you will. In the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, Omri became king over Israel, and he reigned 12 years. He reigned 6 years at Tirzah, right? And those 6 years are going to be followed by something he's about to do where he's going to move the capital. Kind of like David. Remember? David, he reigned from Hebron first, but then what did he do?
He moved it to Jerusalem.
Yeah, he went and conquered Jerusalem and made Jerusalem his capital. Well, Omri's going to do something very similar. And he bought the hill Samaria from Shemer for 2 talents of silver. And he built on the hill and named the city which he built Samaria after the name of Shemer, the owner of the hill. Right? So now we learn where the name Samaria comes from. It comes from Shemer. Right? So this sounds like David in 2 ways. Right? David conquered Jerusalem and made it a new capital. Well, this guy is conquering a city and making it a new capital. But remember how 2 Samuel ended? David bought the hill on which the temple was going to be built. Well, this guy is buying a hill from another dude, right? So once again, you see these parallels between the 2 guys. And you've got to see, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And we're going to see it's a bad thing for Omri, right? So Samaria is going to be the new capital of Israel, right? And it's going to be the capital until the very end, right? So when the Assyrians finally destroy Israel, it's because they destroy Samaria in 722 BC, which currently is approximately where we at over here. We are in like 885 to 884 or 874. So Samaria will basically be established for about 150 years before it gets destroyed by the Assyrians. And Omri did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh and acted more wickedly than all who were before him. Yikes! I mean, after having seen what the other people have done, you're kind of like, how you act more wickedly than that?
And that was the same wording that they used for Jeroboam or Rehoboam, right? One of them?
Probably.
I think it also mentioned like that they were worse than everyone before them.
Oh, yes. Which one? I want to say Rehoboam, maybe.
I think so.
Yeah. I think it was Rehoboam. So Omri did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, and he acted more wickedly than all who were before him. For he walked in all the ways of Jeroboam son of Nebat, and in his sins, which he made Israel sin, provoking Yahweh, the God of Israel, to anger with their idols. So once again, do you notice the association with God's anger being provoked with kings leading Israel into sin? Right? That's what the connection is. Right? It's not simply the kings sinning, it is the fact that they are leading God's people into sin. Right? Like this is offensive to him. Right? Those are his children. Like this is like if you showed up or it's like this, right? It's like if you had children and you entrusted your kids to a babysitter and the babysitter took the kids partying, you would be ticked off because you're like, the whole reason I hired you was to take care of my children. But instead, you drove the kids into sin, right? You hire a babysitter and then they take your, what's the thing? A drive-by. Right? They have the kids hop in the car and then they go on a drive-by and give them guns and stuff. You're just like, what? No. You were supposed to guide the children and you were supposed to take care of them. Not do this. Right? And so God is ticked that these kings keep doing this. Despite the fact that, they should learn their lesson. Right? Because once again, you go read the Torah and it says, if things are really unstable in the land, it's probably because you're sinning. Yeah. And, they literally just got over a king who lasted a week and who killed himself. That's probably a good sign that things are bad in the land. They just got out of a civil war. That's probably a good sign things are not good in the land. They have been fighting the Philistines for 24 years at the same place. Probably a sign things are not good in the land. But they're not repenting, right? They're not learning their lesson. For he walked in the way of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and in his sins, which he made Israel sin, provoking Yahweh, the God of Israel, to anger with their idols. Now the rest of the acts of Omri, which he did, and his might which he showed, are they not written in the books of the chronicles of the kings of Israel? So Omri slept with his fathers and was buried in Samaria. and Ahab his son became king in his place. Now Ahab is somebody that we're going to talk about at the end of this chapter, but we're going to talk about him even more going forward because Ahab is going to be the king whenever a prophet named Elijah shows up. And we're going to spend a few chapters dealing with Elijah, especially at the very end here of 1 Kings. Isn't it crazy that we're already getting near the end of 1 Kings? Slowly but surely? Crazy. Okay, so there is Omri. And now what I wanted to do real quick is take a little aside to just show you where some of these cities are at. Right? Not necessarily because it's not super duper important. I just like to show you because it's helpful to me. All right. Jericho, we have not read about that yet in this chapter, but we're going to read about it on the next slide, which is, I believe, the last slide of this chapter. But we did read about Tirzah, right? So Tirzah, you'll notice, is up in like the top right of Israel, and that was functioning as the capital. But Omri moves the capital to Samaria. Why do you think he moves it there?
Or look dead center.
Yeah.
It's literally dead center.
If he knows his whole land, that's good center.
Yeah. So once again, it seems like Omri is being very Davidic, right? If you remember, David, like, see where the center of Judah is right there? Like the circle on Judah? That's Jerusalem, right? Whenever the city, like the whole place was unified, Judah went even further down at that time period, right? So during the height of David's kingdom, whenever he made Jerusalem the capital, it was the center of his kingdom. And it was on the border of where the Judah and Israel tensions were at. And David was doing that to unify the people, right? So David was being very politically savvy when he chose Jerusalem. He was choosing a place that would unify the people. Well, it seems like that's what Omri is attempting to do as well. They just finished a civil war where he was reigning from Tirzah, and now that the civil war is over, he goes and buys Samaria so that he can have a central city to help unify the people, right? So it seems like he's literally like just picking everything from the David handbook, right? The only thing he doesn't pick up on is the thing that actually made David special, which is being a man after God's own heart, right? That's the reason God picked David. But Omri learns all the wrong lessons from David, and unfortunately, Omri's son Ahab is going to learn all the wrong lessons from Solomon as well. Gibbethon over there, you see that's on the edge of that territory. Like that whole strip right there is the area of Philistia, right? This is where the Philistines were at. Nowadays, ironically, if you were to pull out a map, you would notice that that is the area known as the Gaza Strip, which is where Palestinians are at. Fun fact, the word Palestine actually comes from the word Philistine, right? I think I mentioned this before, but the word Palestine is literally just the Greekified version of the word Philistine, and that's because after the Romans had overthrown Israel and stuff, back in AD 70, a little while later, they decided to spite the people of Israel that they were going to rename the place to basically wipe off. I don't remember if it was the Romans who renamed it or if it was somebody else. I think it was the Romans. But they decided they were going to rename Israel to something else to spite the Israelites and to basically wipe off their memory from the face of the planet. And so what did they name it? Palestine, right? And it remained named Palestine up until the time, until 1948, when Israel became a nation again, right? And so if you look at older King James Bibles and you look at a map, it will say Palestine because that's just what it was called. But that was literally they were literally naming it the land of the Philistines, right? Because it was almost like saying your enemy has beaten you, right? And so that's why nowadays is first off there's political charge to the names Israel and Palestine nowadays, especially with the war going on.
1948. That's not.
No, that's very recent.
Ago, yeah.
No, Israel was not a nation for 2,000 years.
Is that 80 years ago?
Yeah, it's wild. But so that's why even before this whole war was going on, this is why if you go to Israel and you accidentally call it Palestine, they will not like that, right? Because to them that name is an insult. I believe the word Palestine literally means invaders, right? But I just want to highlight that because I have to catch myself sometimes because so many scholarly material things that you read call it Palestine just because that's what it was called for those 2,000 years, just because that's what they had named it, right? But I have to catch myself because from a biblical perspective, you don't want to call it that because it was named that for ulterior reasons, right? But yeah, I just wanted to highlight that. So Gibbethon, that is the land of Philistines right there. And then Jericho, we are going to talk about Jericho in just a second. But I'll have you notice it is like right off the Jordan River, which is going up, like the Jordan River goes straight up from the Dead Sea to the Galilee. And it was the first city that the Israelites conquered when they went into Canaan, right? And so the fact that it gets brought up here again is almost going to suggest an anti-conquest, and you'll see what I mean by that.
So that's the Dead Sea right there, that one on the bottom?
Yes, the Dead Sea is the one at the bottom, and the Sea of Galilee is the one on top. And then the Mediterranean Sea is the thing on the west. All right, let's finish up this chapter.
Now Ahab, the son of Omri, became king over Israel in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah. And Ahab, the son of Omri, reigned over Israel and Samaria 22 years. And Ahab, the son of Omri, did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, more than all who were before him. Now it happened, as though it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, that he took Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, as a wife, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. So he erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. Ahab also made the Asherah. Thus Ahab did more to provoke Yahweh, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. In his days, Hiel the Bethelite built Jericho. He laid its foundations with the loss of Abarim, his firstborn, and set up its gates with the loss of his youngest son Segub, according to the word of Yahweh, which he spoke by the hand of Joshua, the son of Nun.
Very cool. All right. Yes, sir.
I've heard the name Jezebel somewhere. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
We will talk about that as we go through this for sure.
This is her first introduction.
This is Jezebel's introduction. Yes.
Yeah.
A lot of okay. So one thing that I will mention just right off the bat is that whenever people think of Jezebel, usually the first thing they think of is like sexual promiscuity, and that is actually less from 1 Kings, and that's actually more from a reference that you have in Revelation. There might be something associated with that, but Jezebel is a horrible woman, right? Like we're gonna see that here. We're gonna hear about Jezebel a lot over the course of the next few chapters, so you'll get to know her really well. But I'm excited to tell you a little bit about her name in just a second.
Yeah, because I remember reading through, like, I've read through 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and I remember reading her story. It was like, oh, there's not a lot of sex.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying.
That's evil. But yeah.
Yeah, like usually whenever people think about, like they say, oh, somebody's got a Jezebel spirit, you'll hear like charismatics say that a whole lot. Usually they're speaking of like adultery and stuff like that, or like lust. And if you just read 1 Kings, you're not going to understand where they get that from. They get that more from like Revelation, because there's like a woman that they call Jezebel in like the letters to the churches. Okay, so here we have Ahab, and I mentioned how if Omri was the counterfeit David, Ahab is the counterfeit Solomon, right? And we're going to see that as we go through this.
And then would Jezebel be the counterfeit wife, maybe?
The wives who lead the king into sin,
Okay.
right? Yeah, because Solomon's wives, they led him into sin. Jezebel's going to do the same thing. Jezebel and Ahab are kind of like a Bonnie and Clyde situation. They're both just evil people who just produce greater evil. So now Ahab, son of Omri, became king over Israel in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah. Do you see once again the chronology thing there? Because it said that Omri became king in the 31st year, right? And then it says that he reigned for 12 years, but now his son becomes king in the 38th year. Well, that only sounds like 7 years, right? But if you include those, if you start at the 27th year, remember because it said that Zimri reigned in the 27th year for a week? Well, 27 plus 12 would be 39, but if you include the 27th year with it, then you get to 38, right? So it seems like what it was suggesting was that 4 years of civil war followed by 8 years of like peace, like if that makes sense, right? I'm just trying to kind of reconcile all that. So Ahab, son of Omri, became king over Israel in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah. Asa is just chilling this whole time, right? But Asa, as we will see, he will die while Ahab is still king, right? And Asa's son Jehoshaphat will be the one to take over. So, Ahab is going to reign over Israel for 22 years from Samaria. And Ahab, son of Omri, did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh more than all who were before him. Surprise, surprise, right? We've got another evil king, and he is just advancing the evil, right? Really depressing stuff. I love this verse, though. Like, you can just feel the snark in the author's voice as he says this. Now it happened, as though it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam son of Nebat, that he took Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, as a wife, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. Wow. He's like, you know that one thing that all the other kings, like, that was like their big sin? To Ahab, that was trivial. Right? He's like, he's like, oh yeah, I did all that sin for breakfast. Right? That's how Ahab is. Right? I just love, like, as if it was a trivial thing. Right? I mean, like, all these other kings, they were wiped off the throne for doing this. Ahab, it was trivial to him. Now it happened as though it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam son of Nebat. Right? When it talks about the sins of Jeroboam, what is it specifically talking about? Because it's referenced that several times with each king. What specifically was Jeroboam's sin?
Idolatry.
It was idolatry, but it was a little bit more than just that.
Like the whole fake religion thing?
Fake religion, right? So not only did he lead them to idolatry, but remember, Jeroboam didn't necessarily abandon Yahweh, right? What he did is he created 2 golden calves and replaced the worship in Judah with the worship of the calves, right? And so he still said, this is Yahweh. These are the God that took you out of Egypt. And so he basically just created his whole new religion, right? And it seems like that is the religion that predominantly Israel's been following this whole time, right? So they haven't been, they probably were starting to worship other gods, but the main thing they've been doing is walking in the sin of Jeroboam, right? They had adopted Jeroboam's religion and had been worshiping these 2 golden calves. And they had all of Jeroboam's priests serving as priests. And that's what they've been doing, right? And basically the author is saying, oh, Ahab was not satisfied with just doing that. No, Ahab had to make it worse. He took Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, as a wife, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. There is so much we could talk about in this one verse right here. First off, what do you notice about the name Ethbaal?
I noticed Baal's in it. I don't know what the Eth means.
Yes, I don't know what Ethbaal means, like Eth means either. But Baal, that's the god Baal, right? And this guy is the king of the Sidonians. And do you know what city Sidon is usually associated with? Tyre, yes. Tyre and Sidon, they were basically twin cities, right? They were coastal cities up in Lebanon, right? Or known as Phoenicia right here, right? So they're Phoenician cities just north. They're port cities on the edge of the Mediterranean. They were like very prosperous cities back then, right? Usually in the Bible, you will see Sidon and Tyre side by side. Turns out that this Sidonian king, his name is Ethbaal, and he worships the god Baal. Surprise, surprise. Baal is in his name. He worships the god Baal. This tells us a little bit of something, because if you go back into the United Monarchy, we had David having good relationships with Tyre and Sidon. Remember? Who was David really good friends with? It was the king of Tyre. Hiram, yes. Hiram, king of Tyre. I know, I'm trying to test y'all, see if you remember these names. Right, David was really good friends with Hiram, king of Tyre. And if you remember, it seemed like Hiram had come to worship Yahweh. But it seems like they've gone back. Right? To be fair, we don't know for sure if Sidon had also worshipped Yahweh. But it seems like David had a working relationship with them, and he probably wouldn't have done that unless they had gotten on board with him. Right? Because David's whole thing was like, being faithful to God. And so what we could have here is this hint that the people from Tyre and Sidon, they had begun to worship Yahweh, but they had backslid. Right? So just like Israel turned away from God, so too their neighbors did. And that's probably because of Israel's terrible example. Right? Israel was supposed to be a light to the nations, but they started worshiping other gods. And so too the others have as well. In Matthew chapter 11, Jesus is going to criticize 2 sister cities in Galilee. He's going to criticize Chorazin and Bethsaida, and he will criticize them for rejecting him, and he'll say, it would have been better for Tyre and Sidon on the day of judgment than it is going to be for you. And that's because Chorazin and Bethsaida have done the same thing to him that Tyre and Sidon did. Right? They placed their faith in God, but rejected him whenever he came to them. Right? And so here we have Sidon, they're worshiping Baal, and they're going to guide Israel into Baal. And the way this happens is through a woman named Jezebel. Most scholars agree that the woman's actual name would be Jezubel, right? And Jezubel, and that's because in Phoenician, Jezubel means where is Baal, right? That's what the name means. Jezebel, though, this seems to be the author's intentional, like he just changes the name just ever so slightly, just to inflect it a little bit differently to where it changes the meaning of the name and it turns it into an insult. Because Jezubel means where is Baal. Jezubel means where is dung. Like where is poop, right? To where it basically seems like so her actual name is probably Jezubel, but the author calls her Jezebel as a kind of insult, like he's like mocking her, right? Jezubel, like it's like all you have to do is just change a little bit of a letter, and where's the dung? Oh, there she is, right? Like that's kind of what's happening here, which I find very funny. But you've got Jezubel, daughter of Ethbaal, from the Sidonians who worship Baal, and now you have Ahab marrying her. Well, that sounds a lot like Solomon, right? Solomon had many foreign wives, and they led him into sin. Solomon had a good working relationship with Tyre, right? Well, Ahab has a good relationship with Sidon. Well, Tyre helped Solomon build a temple for God. Well, guess what? The Sidonians are going to help Ahab build a temple for Baal, right? And so you have these parallels, right? Omri is like a counterfeit David. Ahab is a counterfeit Solomon. He marries a foreign wife. He makes a temple, but he's not making a temple to Yahweh. He's making a temple to Baal. And so he takes in Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, as a wife, and he went and served Baal and worshipped him. That is how he did something worse, right? It's one thing to turn to idolatry, but he has gone beyond that, and he has made another god his god altogether, right? So he's not simply worshiping Yahweh in the form of golden calves. He is now also worshiping Baal, and he did this by taking in Jezebel into his household. So he erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. Just like Solomon erected the temple for Yahweh in the house of Yahweh that he built in Jerusalem, right? So David conquered Jerusalem, and David bought a hill, conquered Jerusalem, made it the capital. Solomon built the house of Yahweh in that capital. Omri buys a hill, makes the capital in Samaria. His son Ahab builds the house of the temple in that capital, right? So you have these parallels, but where David was leading the people to Yahweh, Ahab and Omri are leading the people away from Yahweh, right? So we have a regression, right? David and Solomon were building to a climax. Here we are building to destruction. Ahab also made the Asherah. Thus Ahab did more to provoke Yahweh, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. Ahab is the worst of the worst so far. And this is where we're going to see that God has enough, and he's going to send a prophet named Elijah to get onto them. Ironically, when you get to the Gospels, you also have a wicked king with a wicked wife who is going to be confronted by an Elijah-like prophet. Right? You have Herod Antipas, who takes a foreign wife, and John the Baptist is going to show up on the scene to criticize Herod Antipas and his foreign wife for their sin, and that's going to be what gets John the Baptist imprisoned. Right? And whenever you ask Jesus who John the Baptist is, he says he was the Elijah who is to come. Right? And so you do have these parallels here in Scripture. In his days, Hiel the Bethelite built Jericho. He laid its foundations with the loss of Abiram his firstborn, and set up its gates with the loss of his youngest son Segub, according to the word of Yahweh which he spoke by the hand of Joshua son of Nun. Why do you think it mentions this?
I don't know. I don't know what the deal is.
Could be talking about the fact that Joshua conquered Jericho. Back in
It did
Genesis.
talk, yeah.
You know, not
Joshua,
in Genesis, Joshua.
yeah.
I don't even like that Genesis.
Joshua chapter 6. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. Yeah. So it mentions that in Ahab's days, this city was rebuilt. It probably mentions this because you can't just rebuild the city. You can't rebuild a city without permission from a king, right? So Ahab is the one who gave permission to this. But do you know what the problem is there? This is what you read at the end of Joshua chapter 6. Then Joshua made them take an oath at that time, saying, "Cursed before Yahweh is the man who rises up and builds this city Jericho. With the loss of his firstborn he shall lay its foundation, and with the loss of his youngest son he shall set up its gates." So Yahweh was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land. Right? So Joshua's conquest of Jericho, the reason it's so famous is because that is the first city the Israelites conquered when they came to the Promised Land. This is the first one. So this city was a sign that God was with them and that God would give them the land. And so Joshua said, anybody who rebuilds this, cursed are you. Your firstborn will die and your youngest son will die. Just in the act of rebuilding it. Because you're basically spitting in the face of God. And you're rebuilding the very city that he destroyed to give you the land. Well, during Ahab's day, what does he do? He allows somebody to go rebuild Jericho. Because he doesn't care what Yahweh says. But the person, it happens to his sons. But ironically...
So Hiel is kind of a random person?
Yeah, Hiel's a random person. We don't know who the heck this guy is.
Okay.
This is just the dude who went and did it.
Okay.
Right? Hiel built Jericho. He laid its foundations with the loss of Abiram, his firstborn. Right? And it said, your firstborn will die with the foundations. And set up its gates with the loss of his youngest son, Segub. Well, it said that the youngest would die with the gates, according to the word of Yahweh, which he spoke by the hand of Joshua, son of Nun. So it's an exact fulfillment. People will debate about exactly how this happened. We don't know if the sons died by accident or if it was actually intentional. It is very possible that Hiel himself sacrificed his children in building the city. Because that was actually a common thing that people did back in the day, where like they would rebuild cities and they would sacrifice children in a way of like blessing the city, right? So it's very possible that Hiel did this, but the author, recognizing what happened here, realizes that he unintentionally fulfilled a prophecy, right? Because here he is so focused on building the city that he sacrifices his own children, therefore demonstrating the curse that has fallen upon him by Yahweh. And this is what I was talking about whenever I say it's an anti-conquest, right? Ahab is literally rebuilding the cities that Yahweh destroyed, right? I mean, God gave them the land of Canaan, and what does Ahab do? He starts rebuilding the Canaanite cities. It's like, well, there you go. That's how bad things are going. Like, you're literally rebuilding the things that God tore down, right? And that's how this story ends, which is going to set up what we're going to talk about next week with Elijah and the widow of Zarephath. So this chapter really, like I've tried to emphasize, it's so redundant and repetitive and frustrating that it's kind of supposed to bring you to this low point where you're like, is God just going to tolerate this forever? Right? You're like, oh my gosh, like this just keeps getting worse and worse. Like you thought it reached a low with the king who reigned 7 days, but then you had Omri and Ahab who literally were like the anti-David and anti-Solomon who led this anti-conquest, and you're like, how long is God going to tolerate this? I mean, if they're rebuilding Jericho, they might as well just welcome the Canaanites back. Enter the prophet Elisha, right? To where, like that's the whole point. The point is you're so frustrated by this and you're like crying out, God, what are you going to do? And he says, don't worry. I've got this figured out. And so he's going to send a prophet to go and confront the people and confront the kings. And this is going to set in motion something that we're going to see increasingly prominent as these kingdoms fall apart, right? And this is going to basically Elijah and Elisha, his disciple, they're going to pave the way for like the prophets that we think of when we think of prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah. Like the people who actually wrote books, Elijah and Elisha, they didn't write books, but they're paving the way for prophets that we think of like that, right? The prophets who wag their fingers in kings' faces and say, get your act together or you will be destroyed, right? So we're making our way there. Sound good? All right. Are there any like things that y'all want to talk about or share before we wrap up? All right. We talked about some application stuff at the beginning of this, really, like earlier on. Don't fall into idolatry. It's not as an exciting life as it looks. And whenever I say idolatry, I'm not talking about bowing down before golden animals. Don't do that either. But I'm talking about the more subtle ways of it, right? God's concerned with the heart. right? And so you don't have to bow down before a golden calf to be idolizing something. Yeah. It's not as exciting life as it looks. You might just be a king who reigns for 7 days and then goes down in a palace of flames. Or you might undo the conquest that God did in the first place. Don't do that. Cool. One of y'all want to close us out in prayer? I knew Rocky would do it. Take it away, Rocky.
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Pray that we all think about what we've talked about today and learn something from it today. Pray that we do not do idolatry, and I pray that everyone here gets home safely tonight. And thank you for your word, in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.